Hello and welcome to panel 2 of the International Conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink, for a New Treaty of Westphalia. This is panel 2 of that conference, and it is called The Development Aspirations of the Global Majority. We're going to begin our second panel with a musical offering, which is also a kind of warning to what the poet Percy Shelley once called the mad, old, diseased, and dying kings. And in this case, we'll refer to the would-be kings, the men and women who would be kings of the dying Anglosphere. The message comes from the German artists Robert Schumann and Heinrich Heine, who were both musicians and poets. And it's a song. It's the song The Two Grenadiers, or Die beiden Grenadier. And it is performed by bass baritone William Warfield, one of the great singers of the 20th century, sung in German, but we have subtitled it in English.
Nach Frankreich zogen zwei Grenadier, die waren in Russland gefangen. Und als sie kamen ans deutsche Quartier, sie ließen die Köpfe hangen. Da hörten sie beide die traurige Mehr, dass Frankreich verloren gegangen. Besiegt und geschlagen das tapfere Heer und der Kaiser gefangen. Da weinten zusammen die Grenadier, wohl ob der kräftigen Kunde. Der eine sprach, wie weh wird mir, wie brennt meine alte Wunde. Der andere sprach, das Lied ist aus, auch ich möchte mit dir sterben. Doch hab ich Weib und Kind zu Haus, die ohne mich verderben. Was schert mich Weib, was schert mich Kind? Ich trage weit besser Verlangen. Lass sie betteln gehen, wenn sie hungrig sind. Mein Kaiser gefangen. Gewähr mir, Bruder, eine Bitt. Wenn ich jetzt sterben werde, so nimm meine Leiche nach Frankreich mit, begrab mich in Frankreichs Erde. Das Ehrenkreuz am roten Band sollst du aufs Herz mir legen. Die Flinte gib mir in die Hand und güt mich um den Degen. So will ich liegen und horchen still, wie eine Schildwache im Grabe, bis einst ich höre Kanonengebrüll und wehende Rosse getrabe. Dann reitet mein Kaiser wohl über mein Grab, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen. Dann steig ich gewaffnet hervor aus dem Grab, den Kaiser zu schützen.
And that is the fate of the Biden Grenadier in that case. And it could be the fate of other Biden Grenadiers if that were to be attempted by the United States, NATO, or other fools. Now, in the last panel at the end, in the question and answers period, Schiller Institute founder Helga Sepp-LaRouche asked the question of the panel whether there were any real signs of intelligent life among American or European or so-called other elites who could actually pick up the challenge of the kind of discussion and dialogue that is needed to bring about a new international security and development architecture. We still are in the process, obviously, of answering that question. What we can do is to give an example of an intelligent and presidential message that was provided in a time not so long ago by the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. This is an excerpt from a discussion, a dialogue that LaRouche was having with various representatives from Russia. This is from the period of 2001, prior to 9/11, prior to the point in which the United States launched upon that set of absurd conflicts, as we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria, Libya, and other locations. And so we are providing this here as a way of trying to promote the discussion of the topic of panel 2, which is the aspirations of the world and the aspirations of the global majority.
There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you will see that the two focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among the nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now this is not railroads. This is not Silk Roads. These are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland to move along the coastways, close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development, or non-development, is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. Intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour without much stopping along the way, and if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? Did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which have emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more, development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong, it doesn't make any sense, they don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes. What most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it, it's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we're in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now there's a third thing, which again Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually, the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor, stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application or discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere, which improves the biosphere, which increases the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. You can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth. We will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international.
If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you from all over the world to today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. And this is panel 2 of that conference called The Development Aspirations of the Global Majority. You've just heard the late physical economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche, who was speaking there in a dialogue with Russian intelligentsia in May of 2001. It was actually hosted in Baden-Württemberg, Germany. And we will just take the opportunity to announce the third panel of our conference, which is tomorrow, because of what you've just heard from Mr. LaRouche on his ideas of development corridors and their scientific implications. That panel, which will be starting at 1400 Central European Time, 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, is called The Implications of the Scientific Revolution Underway. And it has various industrial engineers and physicists and others that will be joining us for that panel. So we just wanted to take the opportunity, given what had been raised, to indicate that to you. Our first speaker today, other than Mr. LaRouche, of course, is His Excellency Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana. Welcome, President Ramotar.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to, first of all, to say how much I appreciated the audio session that we had, which was very, very informative and very, very useful, I believe, for general work. We are actually meeting at a very important, and I would say extremely dangerous time in our world. At this time, the two of the main wars that are ongoing, the war in Ukraine, which is from a humanitarian point of view, it's one of the worst disasters that we have ever had. And the second one is the Ukraine conflict, which is the most dangerous in the sense that it can trigger a nuclear war that can mean the end of life as we do it on Earth. And that is why it is extremely important that we do our best to bring an end to all of these conflicts. But there are other conflicts all over the third world. The Sudan, to name one, all over the third world, you have various conflicts. And a lot of these conflicts are, at the heart of these conflicts, is the whole question of poverty, of underdevelopment, of lack of economic development. Many social scientists have already proven that there is a link between socio-economic development and peace. The more we can have economic development and deal with some social issues, the more we can solve and blunt some of the various problems. Developing countries of the South are riddled with all kinds of conflicts, both internal conflicts and not infrequently problems with each other. This is a direct result of the unequal and unjust international relations that exist in our world. Even though colonialism has largely ended, there are still some pockets of it here and there. In our Caribbean, for instance, there's still some of that. Largely ended in the mid-1970s. Many of the ties have not actually been broken. This is particularly true in relations to economic development. The exploitation of the third world continues unabated, and that has not changed. In fact, in some cases, particularly because of the development of science and technologically, In many cases, it has actually been intensified and probably even more intensive than during the colonial period. Exploitation of our resources for the benefit of the developed world continues to be a major feature of today's international relations. And this can be seen in the fact that capital flows, the net capital flows, is still very much from the south to the north, from the developing countries to the developed world. That might sound not true when you take into consideration the corporate media always spreading about having to bail out a third world country or having to give donation or making some kind of contribution to a third world country. The news makes it appear as if there is more money coming from the north to the south. But it is estimated that the net flow of resources since 1960 from the developing world to the developed world, and a net flow was some $62 trillion. In today's money, it is calculated to be at 152 trillion United States dollars. Therefore, it is not resources coming from the north to the south. It is actually resources flowing from the south to the north. And this exploitation takes many forms in relation, and it relates to as it relates to the south, the exploitation of our raw materials. We hardly, not many third world or countries in the south are industrialized enough to produce finished products. Therefore, we are still largely an exporter of raw material. And what we find with that, the balance of trade has changed dramatically because the price for industrial goods continue to rise very sharply while the price of raw materials keep growing at a much slower rate. Therefore, almost every year, we have to spend within the third world more resources to buy the same type of goods as we used to buy in previous years. So more of our resources are going to buy goods. And this includes, not surprisingly to us, but it might be surprising to many other folks in other parts of the world, because largely third world countries are more agricultural countries. But we still import a tremendous amount of food into the third world countries in agriculture itself. For instance, the Caribbean, we import more than $4 billion a year in food for this region. And although we are described as being more agricultural, largely because the many of the crops that we produce, like sugarcane, sugar, and rice and so forth, they are exported. But many of the other crops we import in foodstuff we import in our country, and that area has not been properly developed, not without enough resources going into other areas of food production. That is more and more in our region, is more and more being seen. And in the CARICOM itself, there's a talk about cutting production of importation of food because we do have the possibility of doing that. There's not a lot of investment now into that area, and there's no encouragement locally to try to produce more. Then there is the balance of trade, because even though we have in the independence, the influence or the voice of this global south of the third world is not very, very well represented and very strong in very important institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organizations, and so forth. These organizations are still controlled by the more powerful country in the world, particularly in the United States, and it is run in their interests. And that is why we are perpetually in debt, and very often you heard in the 1980s about the debts, and you're still hearing now about the debt. The debt is one of the mechanisms that bleeds our resources, financial resources, and contribute to the flow of it's contribute of the flow, net flow of resources from the north to the south. At one time, we used to describe many of the IMF programs as being debt traps. So we have money flowing out by debts through these international institutions, through government lending, through a lot of private lending now from the banks in the developed world, and also from investments, some of the investments in oil and gas, in gold and in other resources. The profit and the payback period is very, very quick. And then very soon, we become a net exporter of capital. And it is not, hardly any of these things are processed here. For instance, all of our gold in Guyana that we produce are refined in Canada. Every drop of oil that is now being produced, because we're now being recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, we have become an oil producer, but there is no refinery here to refine anything, so we hardly get anything from the byproducts, and that is a feature in many third world countries where we continue to remain as raw producers material. So this leads to a lot of trading balances, and we increasingly pay higher prices for goods, manufactured goods, than what that we need than we have here. Therefore, despite colonialism being, let's say, abolished, I think it is, in a way, there's a kind of a collective type of colonialism that has developed over the years with the developed North. Mainly the NATO countries themselves are the ones that continue to exploit third world countries for that. The main reason for all of this is, as I said, the international institutions are not in our favor. Even though we're seeing from the political point of view and justice point of view, the ICC, for instance, which is another international body, it generally wants to try more leaders from the third world. And people look at how long it takes. So 8 months after Israel has murdered, clear signs of genocide. Up to this morning, I was listening to the news, and they are now in the process of destroying people's homes, blasting them with dynamite. People just looking at it. The whole intention is to make Gaza unlivable. The whole intention is ethnic cleansing, but that is continuing. And the International Court of Justice is still to pronounce on many of these things. We note how quickly they were able to, they pronounced on Russia and President Putin, even though what they were doing were moving children out of danger, out of war zones. They have been charged, but Netanyahu only recently that they are talking about charging him because of the control that they have. It is for this reason that the rise of alternatives is so important for us in the West. And that is reflected in how many countries now are lining up wanting to join the BRICS grouping, because the BRIC grouping is offering some hope to try to create a better balance, a better relation with the third world countries. And that is why we see that there is a lot of enthusiasm in the developing world towards BRICS and wanting to join BRICS and hoping to have a better deal from BRICS, hoping that the relationship with BRICS will not be the same type of relationship that we've had with IMF, World Bank, and other type of those type of international organizations that came out of the Bretton Woods area. Another important area that we have seen is the Belt and Road Initiative that China has started. And that is dealing a lot with the deficit that the third world country has in infrastructure development that has impeded the development of our economy in places like transport, and that is linking a lot of our structures in different places to ensure that we have a better area to a better opportunity for more productive development and for us to be able to process more of our goods and to sell at better prices and so forth. And that is one of the reasons I believe that you find this hostility towards Russia and China in particular, and the slander of these countries. For instance, the same criticism that we've had over the years against the IMF of creating debt traps are being now turned around by corporate media to say that China's Belt and Road Initiative would be creating debt traps, when all the evidence show that that is not true, that actually for the first time, many third world countries are having the opportunity to develop the kind of infrastructure that they need in order to try to build more resources. And therefore, I would say that that is probably one of the reasons it is not as overt as what is happening in Ukraine now, where a proxy war is being fought against Russia to try to preserve the domination of the West. But it is there because they see that these new types of relation will give a possibility for the third world to be able to be more resilient and to stand up to the pressures that we constantly face from international institutions and from Western governments, and to do a program for ourselves. So therefore, that is one of the reasons we have to continue to fight against what is taking place in Ukraine, peace. The third world needs peace. A lot of the fighting in the third world are sometimes generated from outside, and sometimes the leftover of problems, border problems and so forth caused by colonialism. And we need peace. We need a mechanism in the world for peace. And we are now only beginning to see that is developing with the new type of arrangements with BRICS and with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think I've said enough, and I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, President Ramotar. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome everybody to today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute. This is panel 2 of that conference, the development aspirations of the global majority. You have just heard His Excellency Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana. Our next speaker is Henry Baudet Lomar, a Bolivian Charge d'Affaires in the Bolivian Embassy in Washington, but he's speaking in his capacity as Professor of International Affairs at Nura University in Santa Cruz, Bolivia.
Muy buenas tardes. No sé si me escuchan con claridad.
Yes, we're trying to make sure we have the translation.
Good morning. Good morning. I hope that you can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here with you at this conference of the Schiller Institute. Unquestionably, these feelings of concern which darken the whole international community because of what's happening is also the result of a long process of the way the international system has been shaped. Let's recall that since 1991, the international system has been going through a very complicated process, perhaps the longest one, of establishing a new international order, which almost the entirety of the Global South have joined to be able to turn the page on what, to some degree, was a pattern of behavior of relations between North and South. It is, in fact, true. We have left behind some schemes and architecture related to power associated with colonialism. Nonetheless, throughout this whole period, especially since 1945 until 1991, perhaps a little later, it has been characterized by a systematic emphasis of dependence in all of its ramifications, enormous dependency, economically, technologically, dependence on trade, because our trade balance between the South and the North is highly disadvantageous to the South. Also, with regard to the technologies required for public health, the COVID pandemic has unmasked the Franciscan conditions in which a large part of the health conditions are not only in the South, but also we've seen the difficulties of this in countries in the North as well. However, the countries in the South have had to carry out enormous efforts to be able to overcome the consequences which the COVID pandemic brought with it. Unquestionably, we are at a moment, we're at a crossroads in the purpose of being able to consolidate a new economic order. Bolivia has adopted firmly the need to be able to concretize this aspiration of a multipolar order, because this new configuration, this new order will allow the global South to be able to achieve levels of development. And when we do that, we're talking about these levels of development. We're obviously not talking about the 1960s and 1970s, that idea which, for example, ECLAC had promoted. This is the ECLAC model of development, which to some degree was a very limited approach. In fact, it's far too small for the challenges that the South faces to be able to really have development. Because when we talk about development, this has to be translated unquestionably into the elimination of all of the indicators of structural violence. Latin America is a region which is characterized by being a region of peace. And in fact, if we look at the other continents, perhaps leaving Oceania aside, the number of armed conflicts which have occurred in our region is significantly less than those which have occurred in other continents. One way or another, that attribute, which means that this gives us a certain amount of prestige, one might say, to be a region of peace, nonetheless, this is eclipsed, or at least it's darkened, by the grave structural indicators, the difficulties of enormous social sectors to be able to have basic services such as sewage systems, such as the educational system, which in many countries in Latin America is facing grave difficulties where there's almost technological obsolescence. There are problems in public health as well, and poverty and misery, which are the most serious indications of social violence. Also, perhaps we should also talk about this idea of America region of peace, because you can't have peace if you have indicators of structural violence. You can't have peace when there are broad areas which lack even the possibility of satisfying the minimal requirements, such as to be able to take food home. You can't talk about peace in a region where you have pockets of discrimination. You can't talk about peace when the levels of insecurity for citizens in some of the cities, that insecurity is growing. You cannot talk about peace when the international criminal organizations, such as trafficking of persons, of drugs, and also to a somewhat lesser degree, trafficking in weapons. This hits civil society in Latin American countries as well. However, nonetheless, perhaps this difficult picture, which we listened to in the first panel, beyond the economic and social indicators which we see in Latin America or South America, we have the possibility of being able to turn the page and have the opportunity for development in South America. and specifically in Bolivia, which is a country which over its history has been an exporter of raw materials since our colonial period and up until quite recently. Bolivia has pretty much been a mono producer of raw materials. In the past, it was silver, then tin, and in recent years, gas, natural gas. However, in recent years, Bolivia has become a big exporter of natural gas. The main markets have been Argentina and Brazil. However, when we talk about development, we don't want to simply reproduce that same scheme of generation of resources, which have been important to be able to improve to some degree the conditions of life. But of course, that's not the most effective and efficient way to take advantage of the enormous amounts of natural resources which Bolivia has. Our intention, therefore, is once we are able to establish and strengthen the BRICS, which Bolivia has stated its desire to join, to apply for membership, that the BRICS should become not just a new structure of power internationally, and which we will no longer be subordinate in the South with regard to the North, and we will be able to have international relations in a framework of principles of equality, solidarity, such that all of the peoples of the world can achieve and develop and achieve certain levels of development. Our purpose of the BRICS also needs to be translated into establishing a new international economic order. Traditionally, the institutions which arose from Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, especially, these are based almost totally as guarantors, not of the purposes of development of the countries of the South, but guarantors of the economic interests of the greatest powers, and especially of those, to some degree, own the largest number of shares in these two important financial institutions. Therefore, that relationship, somewhat asymmetric relationship, one can see in the composition and the decision-making bodies for these organizations. This has always been a kind of obstacle or difficulty for the countries of Latin America, and especially for the Global South, to be able to achieve more successful levels and to achieve the total development that they require. The challenges which we have to do with achieving a greater level of integration in our countries in South America. We have been having a number of integration experiences, the Andean Community of Nations, Mercosur, ALBA, and other such bodies. Some of the limitations which these integration processes have has to do with the weakness in infrastructure, highway and other infrastructure. To be able to have efficient infrastructure integration, we have to have a whole scheme which is efficient of integration of highways, using all the different modes of highway. I'm speaking not only of highways, but also railroads, waterways. They must all be developed and integrated to be able to improve our physical integration and to allow the countries of the South American nations, especially Bolivia, which does not have, because of a war which was provoked in 1879, we're a landlocked nation, and therefore our ties with the international market, unfortunately, goes through some difficulties, such as to have access to specific ports. The fact of the matter is that for Bolivia, the BRICS are not only a kind of scheme of power relations, but rather also an opportunity, such that the resources which are needed to achieve that level of full set development can flow, and that we change that asymmetric relationship which exists in international trade and development. I would like also at this occasion to comment briefly on situations which have occurred and which are tied to the weakening of international law. We have been witnesses in the last 40 years or so of three developments which should cause us to think very deeply on the issue of this role of international law to be able to avoid what is now happening in Gaza. In the recent years, there have been 3 such cases which should lead us to a certain amount of shame for the international system, what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Kosovo, and now what's happening in Gaza. It were important in the framework of these aspirations, not only of the Global South, but of the entire international community, of humanity as a whole, to also develop more creative and efficient ways of guaranteeing that never again will these kinds of developments occur, such as what we are now seeing in Gaza, where unquestionably this casts a shadow on the dignity of man when these kinds of atrocities are carried out against peoples, which this is no question, this is a kind of ethnocide, a kind of crime that's underway in Gaza. Bolivia has hopes that bit by bit, slowly, that to the degree to which the BRICS becomes powerful and grows in terms of the number of states, we will also take up the challenge of bringing to the international community and a view of international law that does not depend on the use of force, so that never again will we have situations like these 3 which I've mentioned, which these are not from long ago. These are just from the end of the last century, and this last one of Gaza, it's the beginning of this century. Finally, to conclude, I would like to underscore that Bolivia, in addition to having important natural resources, we believe these should be converted into a kind of trampoline towards industrialization of those resources. We believe that South America especially has a tremendous opportunity. Those countries which have great lithium resources, this famous lithium triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia in South America, we hope that the maturity to be able to think in the long term and with the purpose of constituting, you have these 3 countries constitute, in South America constitute a region which can provide not only the natural resource of lithium and of course contribute to the possibility, the transformation of its reduce fossil fuel consumption to be more efficient so that climate change doesn't worsen, but it will be very important as well that we be able to unify our wills in each of those 3 states to make this a resource which will serve humanity and not become simply yet another case, as have occurred in the past, where natural resources were exploited and the peoples which owned them simply were left without anything and watched how those resources were transferred to the north. Rare earth metals are another example of such opportunities, of course, for South America to make a contribution, but that must be translated as well to aspirations for full development, which will reduce those economic indicators which are, in fact, structural violence. That for now, and I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity.
And we thank you, Professor Bandel-Lamar. If you've just joined us, we welcome you from all over the world again to panel 2 of today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute, the Development Aspirations of the Global Majority. And you have just heard Professor Henry Bandel-Lamar, who is the Professor of International Affairs at the NUR University in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. Our next speaker is Professor Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State of the Italian Ministry of Economic Development, and an economist and an architect of the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative between Italy and China. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Greetings from Shanghai, where I'm here today. Thank you to the Schiller Institute and everyone for being here. Thank you for the invitation. I will be relatively brief. I want to give you some key points that maybe you can take away from my short speech. The first key point is that there is another way. There is a better way for world countries to interact with each other. When we move from this unipolar world to a multipolar world, so when the West loses its relative strength, which is US-led, and the global South emerges, this tectonic shift creates natural tensions. And these natural tensions is pretty much a conflict of two philosophies of doing business. One is based on the zero-sum game, which has been the philosophy that so far Western countries have adopted. If I win, you lose. If you lose, I win. This philosophy has been challenged, of course, by China and Belt and Road countries, BRICS, and I generally use the term Global South. You forgive me for being generalist, but for simplicity. The alternative view is a win-win, where your prosperity is also instrumental to my own prosperity, and my prosperity is also instrumental to yours. Of course, things are not so easy, and in reality, there may be discrepancies from this ideal win-win approach, but the philosophy holds. The philosophy holds that on average, and taking exceptions away of, let's say, friction in the system that do not really make realize this win-win situation, this philosophy should open the door for discussion of cooperation, not of competition. So the second point that I want to give you is that the zero-sum game focuses on competition, while the win-win focuses on cooperation. We see activities by European countries and the European Union that sees the relationship with China as a systemic rival, sometimes partner, sometimes a competitor. We want to work, all of us here and everyone, to try to shift this philosophical approach and focuses more on the cooperative way. The European Union needs to understand that the economic history for the last 2,000 years tell us that pretty much for 1,800 years of the last 2,000 years, the economy of the world has been dominated by the Asian countries, by India and China. This has changed in the late 1700s with the British in India, and in the 18th century, not 100, when British were again in China. So the emergence and the dominance of the West, of this first US-led hegemony, and now let's say US-European hegemony, has only been a blip in the history of economic development of the last two millennium. So we need to realize that the emergence of the global South is not a challenge. In addition to being something that we can win from, it is also almost a natural and necessary outcome and brings back the world balance to where it has always been. So it's almost a attraction and a reversion to the average that has been with us for a long period of time. So rather than emerging of China, emerging of the global South, emerging of India, I would call it taking back the position that has belonged to them. Of course, China and India being the leading countries, other smaller countries were never dominant, but they, of course, now trail back with India and China. So in addition to this win-win versus zero-sum game, we can try to see and open up what I said at the beginning in an alternative way to develop hand-in-hand business and trade and investment. And this is different from the hand-in-hand that I think our US friends, American friends, see as the only way to be successful. In the US view, hand-in-hand means economic dominance needs to be hand-in-hand with the military dominance, because one is instrumental to the success of the other one. And instead, we should try to move away from this coupling of economic and military dominance with just a economic cooperation. It is very strange when I talk here in Asia with other scholars and members of governments. They always raise the question: the US really is in a very unique and optimal position from a geographic point of view. It is a country that is really isolated by two large oceans. On the north, it borders with a friendly country. On the south, it borders with a relatively friendly country that doesn't really pose military threats. Maybe migrant is the only problem, but at the end of the day, the US could really live in a safe environment just out of its own optimal geographic location. And yes, of course, the US has economic interests in other parts of the world, but so do France, Germany, the UK, and even China. They do prosper those economic interests outside of their own territory without the need to have the second leg, the second hand, the military dominance. So I think the success of China in other countries outside of China, the Belt and Road, the investment that is doing in Africa, in other Asia and Central Asian countries, without, hopefully this will be so for some time, without the need of having a dominant military hegemony in those countries, actually shows the way for how the US could also follow that path to have its own economic interest far away from the protected geography of the United States without the need of that military intervention. And sort of the paradox in a way that the US should be in favor and should see with a positive eye the success of China in economic fields, unaccompanied by any military action, because it basically gives them a benchmark on how they could hopefully break up that military and economic hegemony hand in hand, and really for their own interest reallocate their own time and financial resources to, unfortunately, many and dangerous and growing domestic problems that the US faces. So, geography, my old professor of economics, Rudy Dornbusch, used to tell me, really, Michele, study geography and demography. So where the land is and the people that live in it, to understand the economic dynamic. So I think it's a relatively easy solution to a complex problem. And of course, I'm making it very easy here. The Belt and Road, therefore, for me, is an example of success, of a prosperous economic development in the land areas of Asia and Africa. And I'm really happy to have listened earlier on to the visionary speech of Lyndon LaRouche that really 25 years ago, in 2001, 10 years, 12 years before even President Xi Jinping mentioned for the first time the Belt and Road, he had envisioned the benefits of developing land routes as an alternative to sea routes, and a very insight and really visionary economic analysis to think that the side effect of having that transit would bring economic benefits, not just at the end points, but also in within the route, that would almost subsidize the cost of building that infrastructure and cost, so that basically transporting goods would be at a zero cost, because you have the beneficial effect of the economic development that, of course, the sea do not bring. And so And this is exactly one of the reasons at the beginning. I thank you very much for mentioning me as being one of the driving force of Italy joining the Belt and Road, because I did really make this similar point that the Belt and Road is not really something between Italy and China. It's not just between exporting goods between Italy and China and so on, or even investment between those two countries, mine and China. But it is about cooperating and developing every country that is in between. So all Asian and all African countries and part of the European countries. So I completely share the view that the Belt and Road is not a point-to-point, but it's really a multi-point to multi-point initiative. Does it have problem challenges? Yes. Are there projects that fails? Yes, of course. That happens in the real world. But the rate of failure, the debt trap, is still within normal international standards. I used to work in investment banking doing mergers and acquisition, and trust me, if we had a 10% or even a 15% failure rate of some of the projects and an 85% of success, we would have put our signature with blood on those statistics. So I do want to say that criticism of the Belt and Road should be contextualized within really the general benchmark of what are the risks that are intrinsic to doing development in emerging markets. So yes, there are problems, but these are not reasons for not doing those projects. In fact, these are reasons for investing more resources to improve the quality of those investments even more. And finally, the last point I want to make, there is really room for everyone. We have 6 billion people in need of infrastructure development, water, sanitation, agricultural development, you name it. Europe and the US don't need to compete with China on the Belt and Road. This is really an example where we can all work together, complementary. The European Union gateway for the development of Africa, is it a competitor to the Belt and Road? No, it's complementary. China welcomes the initiative of the United States BBW, the EU Global Gateway, and any other, the Middle East corridor. There is really room for everyone. Again, we need to get rid of this way of thinking that we need in Europe to do the Global Gateway to compete or to slow down the development of the Belt and Road. These are two initiatives, the EU Global Gateway, the Belt and Road, that must go hand in hand, not in competition, for the development of Africa. There is room, there is need for both, and there is need also for China and Europe to cooperate on exchanging information, experiences, learning, so that both win. And I go back to this philosophy of win-win. It is not about competition. For a new project that China wins and does it successfully, this is good information for our European company that can learn from that and avoid making the same mistakes somewhere else. Hence, the win for China would also be a win for the European within this context of the Belt and Road. I stop here only making one promise. The moment we have a government change in Italy, again, one of the mission that my political agenda has is, first thing we will do is to bring Italy back into the Belt and Road so that we can restart the process and make our initiative available to other European countries for them also to carefully think about this and hopefully join, again, not as an alternative or as a competitor, but as a complementary initiative to our own European individual countries project. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Geraci, for that very, very good presentation. Some of us have a private joke that we believe that the smartest people in the West are from Italy, and I think you certainly have given some of us justification for that idea. If you've just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's International Conference of the Schiller Institute. The development aspirations of the global majority. You just heard Professor Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State for the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Our next speaker is Volker Hellmeyer. He's the chief economist of Netfonds, which is a German corporation, Shares Corporation. And I believe what this is it's an interview that was done with Helga Sepp-LaRouche, actually, I understand. This is just prior to the conference. We show this to you now.
Hello, Mr. Hellmeyer. I'm very happy that you give us the honor to join us for this conference, because your views are, sometimes almost a lonely voice in an ocean of unreasonability in Germany these days. So let me ask you, a couple of weeks ago or days ago, you gave an interview to Schwäbische Zeitung, where you warned that Germany is about to crash against the wall in an article called Quo Vadis Germany. Please elaborate on your concerns.
Yes, first of all, thanks very much indeed for being here. And I wish you all the very best to give the potential for change in the world, which is absolutely needed. Now, we have three issues regarding Germany. First of all, it's an energy-related issue. Our pricing of energy is not competitive given the world standards. Thus, we have a disadvantage over here. The supply issues on energy are not being solved on a long-term basis. And these two issues play a major role for capital investment. And only with constant capital investment, economies can thrive. The next issue is that due to the sanction policies, which are not in line with WTO law, these sanctions, where we follow the United States and the United Kingdom and the European Union, curtail our business model to a large extent, as we lose import markets of major importance and also export markets. That undermines our business model here in Germany, in Europe. The third issue is on trust. The German economy has lost trust in our politicians. And if you don't have trust, you don't invest. Thus, the capital stock is eroding over here. And this is what we are seeing. Germany went from, in the ranking of the world, from 5th place regarding its competitiveness to 22 from 2014 to 2023. And this is a call to German politicians and also the politicians of the European Union to make a U-turn on so many issues, whether foreign policy, capital investment policy, and having a self-interest and not following the interest of third parties.
Well, when one compares what is being discussed in Germany with what is going on the international stage, it is flabbergasting what a discrepancy there is. There are tectonic changes going on. A whole new system is forming itself in the form of the BRICS, and they represent increasingly the majority of the world population, the world GDP. And why can people in Germany and Europe not see the incredible potential which would lie in the simple cooperation with this new emerging combination of countries?
The answer is pretty simple. Of course, we can see it. And some economists like myself saw it very early. And, we were in touch for a long time, since a long time ago. And we were talking about this, whether Silk Road, BRICS, all these issues relate to each other. Fact is, the Western world does not want to lose its power grab on the world. And back in 1980, the Western world had 80% of world GDP on a purchasing power parity. We are now down to roughly 30. So the global south went from 20 to now 70, but they are growing more than 100 to 150% stronger every year than the Western world. So they will achieve 75, 80% well in time. And that is an economic financial power change, which has already happened. So far, all these countries from the global south were standing for its own, and they had no kind of a impact on the global politics. Now with BRICS forming and BRICS enlarging, I think another 40 countries want to join, this is getting a major player. And Germany is not taking any action on its self-interest, moving towards the global south moving towards the BRICS countries, but rather follows the rules out of New York and Washington and London also. And this is a big mistake, because in the end, we can win a battle, but we will lose the war. And by using means outside the box of the legal business within the world, WTO, World Trade Organization, for instance, we are losing the esteem of the global south every single day. So we are damaging ourselves by not taking part, but this is voluntarily, and I know it because I've been trying hard to push us down the road towards the BRICS, towards the potential of chances. And it didn't work out very well, to put it very in a very diplomatic manner.
Well, I can only agree with you that Germany's reputation is going down, very fast. I talk to many people. But today is the last day of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. There were 19,000 participants from 130 countries. They concluded 850 major deals. So you cannot really say that Russia is isolated. This year, Russia has the chairmanship of the BRICS, and in October there will be the big new summit where it is expected that many new countries will join the BRICS. So why can we not somehow get that reality into the discussion in Germany more?
Well, in order to get something into the discussion, you need the media outlets, and I can only say I haven't been on the media, ARD as our main media outlets, the so-called mainstream media outlets, ever since September 2014, because I had the wrong idea, I think, on certain international issues regarding the Ukraine crisis. Now, let's look at the St. Petersburg Forum. It's a big success, and I clearly state the case that the West has never, ever been more isolated since 1944, when the IMF and World Bank were founded at Bretton Woods. Basically, every single aim the West took after the 24th of February 2022 has backfired. First of all, we didn't get Russia on the knees regarding their economy. Instead, the economy is thriving, and our economy is suffering in Europe. Secondly, there's no international isolation. There's an isolation between the West and Russia, yes, but not the global South. That even has intensified. If you look at the trade flows between the global South and Russia, they have increased. Europe's have gone down. Their share has increased over the last 2 years. Now, if you look at all these things together, we will lose these markets for a very long period of time. And there's one more issue to it. Globalization lowered the poverty in the world. And basically, we are deglobalizing. We are splitting the West from the global South by the politics managed from the US, taken over by the European Union. And we leave the globalization, and thus we will lose potential growth. Whereas the global South, with BRICS, with Shanghai Cooperation, with the RCEP, is still globalizing further on. And thus they have higher potential growth rates going forward. They are smart. And to me, the St. Petersburg Forum just confirms it. There are 130 countries. We have 193 in the United Nations. This tells the story.
Well, I mean, I agree. Fortunately, there is one voice of reason, that is Pope Francis, who has just come out demanding a new international financial architecture. And he put it in the context of the Jubilee year, which is 2025, which has been always an issue to demand debt relief for the countries of the developing sector. Maybe that fits in with the present efforts by the BRICS, a new financial currency, a new financial trade currency, eventually even a reserve currency, and the increase of the function of the new development bank, which has its headquarters in Shanghai. Could you comment on this, please?
Yes. What we've seen is if you look at the shares of world GDP, I mentioned that the Global South stands at 70%. If you look at the quality of statistic data, in earlier years, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, the West always had better structural data. Thus, we had these Latin America crisis, Far East crisis, etc. And the Global South had weak structural data. This has changed also. So it's a change in quantity and in quality. And now what happens is that they set up structures in order to put their economic power and quality into models where we have a balanced, how shall I say, a balanced way how to treat each other. The Western system with the IMF and World Bank has always been a means of putting Western interests first. And you can see that if there's if a decision is taken at the IMF or the World Bank, you need a vote of 85%. And the US has a vote of 15%. So they can stop anything they want. And thus, we have with the new development bank and all these issues now, the chance of new structures. It will take time. And I recommend to the Global South, take time, do a tough and good job, and don't be too fast. Look at the euro. That was a fast lane. It was not the best lane. It was a fast lane.
Okay, so a couple of days ago, Harald Kujat, who is the former general inspector of the Bundeswehr and former head of the military committee of NATO, warned that the Ukraine war is about to turn into the primal catastrophe of the 21st century, in a clear reference to the First World War having that function for the 20th century. Now, many international experts, such as Scott Ritter, Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Mersheimer, many others, are also warning that there is the danger of the crisis or the war spinning into a global nuclear war. What is your view on that, and what must be done to prevent that from happening?
I see that risk because the mindset has changed in Europe. The mindset of politicians. The lessons of the last century are not learned any longer, no. And what we've seen in the Ukraine crisis is a constant escalation by the West. We are not getting the targets we wanted to achieve. And once we see it, we just escalate. And this is something that reminds me of Christopher Clark's book about the First World War, how the countries moved into the First World War. We are exactly on the same path. In that respect, I totally share the views of Scott Ritter, of Jeffrey Sachs, John Mersheimer, and some others. And it's the biggest issue going forward. Economy is one thing. If we destroy the world because of the Ukraine, and it's not because of the Ukraine is a victim of Western policies, grabbing for the world power, though the basis for the world power is evaporating in the field of economics and financials. That is the main issue. It's something about power. It doesn't have to do anything with humanity, not with the morals which we show. Our real colors are different.
Well, thank you very much. And let's work to prevent this from happening.
Indeed, and I wish you the very best. And I want to thank you for all your efforts you have put in for the last decades in order to make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank economist Volker Hellmeyer, who is the chief economist of Netfonds Corporation of Germany, for that interview, which was done with Helga Seppler-Rusch. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference, panel 2 of the conference, The World on the Brink for a New Peace of Westphalia. This conference panel is called The Development Aspirations of the Global Majority. Our next speaker is His Excellency Ambassador Professor Dr. Manuel Hassassian, Ambassador of the Palestinian Authority to Denmark.
With you because I will be traveling. And I would like to start, my speech by giving a brief synopsis about the Oasis plan, because later my discussion or deliberation will be about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how that will be in the context of a plan that will really bring peace, security, and justice through economic development and through ties between North and South and what have you. And allow me to start by shedding a brief light on the Oasis plan sponsored by the Schiller Institute under the title LaRouche Solution for Peace Through Development Between Israel and Palestine and for all Southwest Asia. Peace through economic development is the only successful basis for lasting just peace in the Middle East region. There is no purely military basis for peace or security, and military solution has never been a solution. So there is no purely military basis for peace or security. Only development is essential. However, the greatest impediment to development in our region, which is the Middle East region and Southwest Asia, is the shortage of fresh water, as everybody knows. Because if we don't solve this problem, the next war in the Middle East is going to be over water resources. And through the construction of network of desalination plants, ideally nuclearly powered, that could turn the seawater into fresh water. These plants could connect the Red Sea with the Dead Sea and the Dead Sea with the Mediterranean, as it is outlined in the plan. And it will only come about by rejecting power politics, rejecting geopolitics, and building a new paradigm shift of international relations that is based on a new concept of economic development, i.e., will prevail security and development as a great design. As Helga Zepp LaRouche once said, I'm quoting, "You have to have hope and give the youth a decent future to have a normal life of doing useful things." This plan should be applicable to the Palestine-Israel conflict for its finality and for its duration of longevity for peace and security. And now let me shed light on the current situation in Palestine. I think it is important to know the magnanimity of this great conflict that has been affecting the entire world. And as you can see, it has swept all over the world with public opinion that is becoming more and more aware of what the Palestinians are going through in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Israel's ongoing apocalyptic military campaign against Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem comes on top of 76 years of persecution, displacement, and genocide. It has resulted in mass destruction. It has resulted in displacement of over 90% of the Gazan population and the deaths and maiming of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Mostly, as you know, are women and children. All this amounts to the alert observers as war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Palestinians have been killed in their thousands when homes, schools, hospitals, shelters, mosques, churches, refugee camps have been mercilessly bombed. That is rooted in an ethno-nationalist settler colonial ideology, in continuation of decades of purging. In a nutshell, this is a textbook case of genocide. For the past 250 days, Israel has conducted a sustained campaign of airstrikes targeting civilians in Gaza. And in the latest escalation, around 210 Palestinians have been massacred, with over 400 wounded at Al-Nusayrat refugee camp in central Gaza. The death toll stands at approximately more than 37,000 to date, with half of the victims being children. Tragically, over 10,000 martyrs are believed to be trapped under the rubble of destroyed buildings. This dire situation is exacerbated by the loss of almost 147 UN personnel and the destruction of 32 hospitals, leaving only a few operational facilities with limited resources. Furthermore, all educational institutions, including schools and universities, have been decimated, and numerous religious sites, such as churches and mosques, have been completely destroyed. Control over the Rafah border crossing further restricts access to essential supplies, including fuel, preventing the functioning of vital services, and as a result, approximately 70% of Gaza's infrastructure lies in ruins, intensifying thus the humanitarian crisis in the region. What label best describes this conflict? Is it a defensive war with Israel protecting itself? Or is it a campaign to suppress a people striving for independence? Sometimes I find it ironic when I discuss with European or American politicians, as I've done countless times in my diplomatic career. They continually advocate a two-state solution while Palestine faces increasing destruction. Despite this reality, the rhetoric persists. If they truly support a two-state solution, why do they wield veto power, i.e. the United States and the United Nations, especially when nearly 147 countries have recognized Palestine? Moreover, Europe often follows the lead of the United States in this matter, raising questions about the balance in their approach to the two-state solution. Today, Palestinians are advocating for fundamental human principle of self-determination. And the question arises as to why the global community universally supports self-determination, as articulated in President Woodrow Wilson's 16th article. Yet this principle is often disregarded in the context of Palestine. This prompts reflection on whether Palestinians are perceived as deserving less consideration in their quest for recognition as an independent nation state within the international community. The conflict is not simply a matter of competing claims over shared land. It is perceived as an incursion by Israel. The Zionist endeavor received backing from the international community, which bears the brunt of responsibility to reverse the consequences of such actions. The discourse on the practices associated with this contentious occupation could extend for hours. Yet the crux of the matter is clear. How can we bring about an end to this conflict? Moreover, who are the primary stakeholders endeavoring to forge a resolution? It's frustrating that despite positioning itself as the gavel holder of the peace process for the last 3 decades, the United States has faltered, resorting more to crisis management than conflict resolution. Presently, it's evident that the US has failed dismally in its role as an honest broker for peace, as it has disproportionately supported unequivocally Israel, the dominant party, over Palestine, the marginalized counterpart. Regrettably, our faith in the Americans has been misplaced. I feel sorry for the American citizens who are governed by such ineffective leadership in the United States with a myopic vision to fostering global security and peace. A president advocating for humanitarian access is paradoxically sending thousands of bombs, resulting in the deaths of innocent children and Palestinians in Gaza. How can we tolerate such senile statements from a president who seems out of touch with reality? Sadly, the alternative isn't any more promising. In the current global landscape, the notion of using individuals or countries as mere pawns in international conflicts is increasingly deemed untenable. While such conflicts have the potential to escalate into regional or even global wars, the root causes often trace back to fundamental issues like extreme hunger, abject poverty, lack of economic development, and national interest. Therefore, a question arises. What implications would the recognition of Palestine as a state hold for the international community? Notably, Palestine has previously demonstrated willingness to compromise, as evidenced by its acceptance of only 22% of historic Palestine for statehood in 1988, and this territory encompasses the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, while the remaining 78% was accorded to the Zionist project. Despite this heavy compromise, the cost for further territorial expansion, particularly in the West Bank, persists among the Israelis. That said, it is important to note that Israel's interest in Gaza primarily revolves around security considerations, accessibility to oil, rather than territorial ambitions. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a notable absence of effective and charismatic global leadership, contributing to a sense of stagnation or decline amidst ongoing conflicts, hunger, and injustice. This raises the questions about the quality of democratic representation and the influence of political parties in shaping leadership choices. Despite the abundance of intellectual and institutional resources in the United States, exemplified by renowned think tanks and academic institutions like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, etc., the presidential candidacy of figures like Biden and Trump is viewed by some as impotent and ineffective. This highlights concerns about the dominance of political elites over the electoral process rather than genuine grassroots leadership. The effectiveness of the United States mediator to bridge the gap and inequity between two sides that are not on equal footing is called into question. Negotiations between Israel and Palestine, the imbalance in power dynamics is evident. The United States, holding a dominant position, often drafted resolutions favoring Israel, leaving the Palestinians with little choice but to comply. This lack of parity undermines the essence of genuine negotiations, which ideally involve symmetric negotiations between two contending powers, striving to resolve their differences. However, in this context, negotiations were dictated more by power politics than by sincere dialogue. The Palestinians, as the underdog party, consistently bore the brunt of these imbalances. The current state of demonstrations in Israel appear misleading. However, it's crucial to understand the broader public sentiment. There has been a significant shift in Israeli public opinion since the first Intifada of 1987, with a predominant support for right-wing leadership. The influence of left progressive elements has totally diminished, leading to their marginalization within the political landscape. The emergence of figures like Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu in positions of power reflects this right-wing trend. Consequently, the potential for a more liberal government advocating for peace has been hindered by the prevailing right-wing sentiments in Israel. There is a risk of instigating wider conflicts with Egypt probably, Lebanon for sure, and Iran. Despite the situation being contained thus far, the failure of the US to bring a ceasefire has compromised its total credibility. The current situation in Israel is very volatile, with escalating tensions suggesting a perilous path. There are observers expressing the belief that the destruction of Israel is underway, highlighted by recent events such as student protests in America. These protests unveil a broader critique of Biden's administration's handling of international conflicts, including the Gaza crisis and the Ukraine war. Pundits view this as indicative of a larger pattern of failure in asserting American dominance on the global stage. Drawing parallels, today the impetus for conflict is often rooted in national and economic interest rather than in pure ideology. However, the zealous commitment of individuals driven by religion remains a concern to us. It is important to prevent any potential escalation into a religious conflict, particularly between Muslims and Jews. Our focus is on the pursuit of a national struggle guided by a secular ideology of establishing a democratic entity in Palestine, which aligns itself with the beliefs of our leadership. Yet this vision necessitates collective efforts, including presidential and legislative elections in Palestine, as well as comprehensive reform in our political infrastructure. I say the above as self-criticism because I have to be honest as an academic in order to outline the major steps required to realistically attain sustainable and lasting peace. Finally, embracing the LaRouche concept of economic development as espoused by the Schiller Institute could play a pivotal role in creating global security through regional security, through resolving long-standing conflicts, such as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. By prioritizing economic ties over military solutions, nations from the north to the south can embrace a win-win approach that promotes global stability and prosperity. I wish the conferees all the good luck in their endeavors, and I hope my message is loud and clear, and let's work all together for peace, stability, through economic stability, and through what we call the LaRouche concept, which is the Oasis Plan. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Hassassian. If you've just joined us, welcome to everybody. You're attending panel 2 of our conference, the Development Aspirations of the Global Majority, and you've just heard His Excellency, Ambassador and Professor Dr. Manuel Hassassian, Ambassador of the Palestinian Authority to Denmark. Our final speaker is Professor László Ungvári, President Emeritus of the Wildau University of Technology in Hungary.
Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren von nah und fern, ich bin sehr froh, dass ich heute an dieser Veranstaltung teilnehmen kann.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be participating in the event today. I'm a very international person. I was born in Hungary. I studied in the Soviet Union. I worked a little bit in Hungary. And most of my life, I lived in Germany here. Nearly 21 years. I was head of the Technical University in Wildau. I was the only Hungarian in Germany who got to such a top position in a university. I also worked for 3 years in Almaty, in Kazakhstan. Well, I'm a very helpful person. My wife always says I'm something like Mother Teresa, including now, when there are so many refugees from Hungary and Ukraine. I've helped families. I've provided them with apartments. I've helped them with the authorities and so forth. Just this to show that I'm a very international person. But coming to our topic today, which concerns all of us, let's say that if someone had told me 10 years ago what we would be seeing today in politics, I would have laughed at them. I wouldn't have believed it. But today, I'm very concerned, extremely concerned about developments in the world and in Europe. I'm very disappointed. Probably from the standpoint of someone, of a professor, because a big problem in Europe is that there are more and more people, including young people, who are coming to politics, who have no profession, they haven't studied, they have no experience or very little, but yet they want to make decisions on major issues, and they want to tell us how we should behave. And I think the situation is very developed in that sense in Germany. Just think of the foreign minister, Mrs. Baerbock. Let me say that every time she makes a trip abroad, I'm filled with fear. I'm anxious that she's going to embarrass Germany once again. There's also the question of diplomacy, which is quite different from what it was. Diplomacy used to be really wonderful. Diplomats were educated, intelligent, they spoke intelligent language, and their primary objective or duty was to represent the interests of the home country that they represented with negotiations. They had to try and understand the person they were talking to. And today in Germany, we're told that we have a feminist foreign policy. So what is that? In fact, foreign policy must be global, always in the interest of the country, not for feminist or anything like that. These are just catchwords. Nothing behind them. We're also concerned today with the question of war and peace, including in Ukraine, very near to us. And I must confess here that on the February 23rd, 2 years ago, I was completely convinced that there would be no war. And the very next day, I turned out to be wrong. I'm still very unhappy that Russia, that Putin got provoked into making this war, because it's simply a fact that Russia invaded Ukraine. That gives the everyone the right to say that Russia is an aggressor. But then they don't look further to see why Russia did that. The reasons are hidden. Namely that it was promised to Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union that NATO would not move any closer to the east. It wasn't in a treaty, but it was agreed upon verbally. But we also have to uphold such statements. Now, today, NATO is almost on Russia's borders. And why is this war really going on? We're told that we need to defend our freedom by defending Ukraine. That's nonsense. One U.S. senator even said some time ago that in Ukraine there are, I think, $12 trillion worth of riches in Ukrainian soil. And we cannot let the Russians or the Chinese take that over. We need to do it. So that's one of the real reasons for the war. But there's a lot of propaganda that we hear about this. Diplomacy has been forgotten. Nobody talks about it. Insults are being thrown around that would have been unimaginable some time ago in the diplomatic world. And I'm really sad about that politicians think they are leading us, but they have no experience, including in international relations. And they have no empathy. That's the main problem. So let me come to Hungary now. I was born in Hungary. I follow the policy there. The Fidesz party, which is headed by Orbán, has been for quite some time. On June 9th in the elections, he had 2 victories, once in the European elections and in local elections. You need to know a little bit about the history of this country to understand the positions it's taking today. Twice in history, Hungary was forced into a war or enticed to go into a war. The first time was the First World War, when it was still part of Austro-Hungary. Hungary was not to blame for that war, but it did suffer a great deal, especially in the peace agreements after the war, or as what the Hungarians call it today, are the peace dictates. It was the first time in history that a country had lost 72 regions that had been Hungarian for 1,000 years. It lost 67% of its population that way. Not all of them were Hungarians, but 3.5 million Hungarians suddenly, from one day to the next, were citizens of a different country. It's even said today that Hungary is the only country that's surrounded by itself, by Hungary, by the historical Hungary. If you cross any border, you're still in what used to be Hungary. Now, the Second War was the Second World War. Hungarians joined on the side of Hitler because of false bombing raids by the Germans. That is, that German airplanes put Russian signs on them, and they bombed Hungarian cities, which kind of forced the Hungarians to enter the war. They had huge losses, human losses, technical, territorial losses. And there were some villages that Hungary got, some territories, but they were then taken away. 3 villages in the north, on the border of Austria and Slovakia. Villages were taken away from Hungary. There was a villa of the Czechoslovakian government near Bratislava, what's today Bratislava. So Hungarians have had very, very bad experiences with war. And that helps to explain why the Hungarian government has consistently called for ceasefire and peace talks. And that position is supported by most of the population. That's also because even the young population have heard about what happened in the 2 world wars. They've heard stories from their parents, their grandparents. They've learned history in school. And I think that's the only correct attitude to have. Now, recently, my acquaintances, people I know, told me that during discussions in the EU, the European Union, our Prime Minister Orbán expressed his opinion very openly. And during the break afterwards, when the others were having coffee, then you could hear them saying, "Oh, we do agree with Orbán's opinion, but we don't want to say it yet. We don't want to make it known," and so on. So what kind of presidents, what kind of leaders are these that don't even have the courage to speak out their opinion? So the Hungarians don't like this policy at all. Although my grandparents never spoke positively about the Russians either. And that's the attitude, I think, of a country with a lot of experience, such as Hungary is. And diplomacy means that it's very important because you listen to other opinions. Just yesterday or the day before, NATO Secretary Stoltenberg was in Hungary, and they listened to, in a conversation with the arguments of Orbán. The NATO generals heard him for hours, and at the end, they guaranteed Orbán that the Hungarians didn't have to give soldiers money, technology to NATO for the offensive in Ukraine. So I still hope that common sense will win out, because the politicians are arguing back and forth and saying yes and no, we have to do this or that. But there are several hundred soldiers on both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, who have to fight. So I hope that peace will come for all of us, for Ukraine, Russia, for Europe, and for the whole world.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Dr. László Ungvári, President Emeritus of the Wildau University of Technology in Hungary. He is our final speaker for today, and we'll be going to questions. There was a question that people asked about the questions, because some of the speakers to whom they are directed are not presently on the platform, and you can submit questions. You can put it at the bottom of the screen, so you can have a place to which you can submit questions. We're bringing up our panel in just a moment. Again, this is a 2-day conference, and so tomorrow we will be making announcements about the other panels. At the end, the panel 3 is called The Implications of the Scientific Revolution Underway. It will begin at 1400 Central European Time and 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So that's the panel for tomorrow. And I think we're going to begin to bring people up on screen. And let me just indicate we have questions for we have President Ramotar is there. I see you. I see Helga's there. And I believe, well, first let me just ask Helga, and Mr. Lamar, just to acknowledge you, if you have anything, Helga, you'd like to say first before we go to questions.
Well, I want to thank all speakers. I think they all contributed very useful aspects of the international picture, as you normally do not get it from the mainstream media. President Ramotar naturally, made a very important highlighting of how the persistence of the neo-colonial mechanisms exist. This was also featured by Mr. Boldomore. I think his emphasis on the weakening of international law is also of high concern, because that's clearly a symptom of a breaking down order. I also want to say his emphasis on the lack of the integration of infrastructure in Latin America was addressed, first of all, by Alexander von Humboldt, naturally, in the 19th century. And that was developed by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, with a very important comprehensive Latin American-wide integration plan called Operation Juarez, which was started to be implemented by President Lopez Portillo at the time. So maybe we can pick that up in the discussion. I think also Michele Geraci always has a very amiable way of taking the ghosts away from China, because he has spent so much time there, he's teaching there. And, you know, if people just could take a natural attitude towards the country, which indeed was one of the leading country for actually millennia. The interview I made with Volker Hellmeyer is very refreshing as well, because, you know, every time somebody in Germany has the courage to warn against the fact that Germany is crashing against the wall, it is a sigh of relief. And naturally, Ambassador Hassassian very importantly brought in both the tragedy and genocide of Gaza, but also the solution, which is the Oasis plan. And, you know, I think the way Hungary is being treated by the top politicians and the mainstream media almost makes it a country of the global south. So it's quite natural that it is leaning towards cooperation with these countries. So I think this was very rich, and I thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Helga. I'm going to go first to Professor Balde-Lamar. And here's the question for you. This is from New York. In Peru, the opening of a new deepwater megaport will commence in November of this year on the Pacific coast of that country. The Chancay port, I may have to said, is being built by China's COSCO shipping company and is expected to transform the economy of all of South America. In Bolivia on May 28th, a hearing was held at the parliament in La Paz, in which Peruvian Admiral Carlos Tejada gave an exciting briefing on the economic and strategic implications of that project. It was already mentioned by President Ramotar and Henry Balde-Lamar that the intention of multilateral institutions like the BRICS is to transform South America from a raw materials exporter into a continent exporting value-added products. Another aspect is the medium-term objective of building a bi-oceanic railroad from Brazil to Bolivia to Peru. Do you believe that the inauguration of the port, of the Chancay port, will help achieve this goal? Was the question translated? Okay.
Sí, sin duda alguna, el desarrollo del puerto de Shanghái,
yes, undoubtedly, the development of the Chancay port, together with the bi-oceanic corridor, is one of the main projects, not just for Bolivia, but for South America, keeping in mind that this will link the Atlantic to the Pacific, that is, to join the South American giant, Brazil, connected to the Pacific, and will also allow optimization of opportunities that are now exclusive to the Pacific. It is clear that this first half of the century, the Pacific will become a very intense trade and development potential. So the possibility of integrating these two extremes, the Pacific, South American Pacific with the Shanghai port in China, will clearly increase the trade activity. Therefore, such expectations and in the successful implementation of the bi-oceanic corridor. Unfortunately, political events since October 2019 have frustrated a greater development of this project, particularly the project that Bolivia has in terms of the development of Puerto Bush. As everyone knows, Bolivia does does not have access to either ocean, the Atlantic or the Pacific. And nonetheless, the development of Puerto Bush would give sovereign access to Bolivia through Paraguay for access to the Atlantic, and of course, the bi-oceanic corridor construction would increase the efficiency of transportation to ports on the Pacific. For this reason, the possibility of economic resources arising from the BRICS Development Bank may strengthen this project and eventually bring it to fruition so as to allow qualitative leaps, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of trade exchange.
Okay. And now I have a question for President Ramotar. This is from Margaret Chaldone. It's actually a question that was asked is a general question, but I'll put it forward. There's been some discussion in recent days of the possibility of Turkey joining, the nation of Turkey joining the BRICS. What implications would such a development have on the future of NATO? Would this create a sufficient shock to force a shift in the position of other European governments?
I think it would be a very important. Move, because I think not only with Turkey, I think with Turkey joining BRICS, yes, it will have some implication because they will develop new type of relations, and it could create some type of contradictions within the NATO forces itself. That is quite possible. There's no guarantee that will happen, but that is a possibility. But what it will also do is create within NATO countries another country who would want to have peace for development purposes, as we are seeing right now in the situation with Hungary. The position that Hungary is taking is extremely realistic one. And I think Hungary's position is probably the most realistic in the European countries at this point in time. They recognize that Russia will forever be their neighbor, and there is need for more cooperation with Russia, and they do not want to be part of the process of trying to suppress Russia so that the United States can forever be at the top of the control the world practically as they're doing right now. So I see that as a very positive. If that materializes, I see it as a very positive development that can contribute generally towards the goal that we all seek, to have a world with less tensions, less danger, and one that will be a more peaceful world. I think it will be a positive development.
Okay, very good. Helga, you have any comment on that? If I think you're muted.
I agree.
You agree? Okay.
I agree.
Okay, very good. I have another question for President Ramotar. This is asked by Jose Vega. He wants to know, he says, can I ask President Ramotar about the recent border conflict between Guyana and Venezuela and how it was resolved through diplomatic talks negotiated with Brazil? By recent, it happened back in December, but I think it may have been an important sidestep of war. So that's what he's asking.
It's not really resolved as yet. The matter is within the ICJ. It's in the court right now, and in fact, right now, delegations from Guyana and Venezuela are at the ICJ. I think the ICJ requests some more written presentation on their part. But just to let you know that I hold the position more or less that as President Chavez had. Chavez on more than one occasion said that this was a contrived situation, that the border was settled since 1899. And this issue was created during a specific period in the 1960s when the cry came up that Guyana will be a second Cuba. In fact, Guyana, that was the first time the slogan was used about second Cuba, was talking about Guyana in the 1960s. And the Americans wanted to have that as a leverage in their hand in order to try to deal with any left-wing government that they thought that might come to government in Guyana. So my own view is that I believe that, very strongly believe that the evidence is very dominant in Guyana's favor, that that we had a signed agreement, we had an agreement that said that this was settled forever, and this was a clear manipulation. It is unfortunate that that, in my view, that President Maduro will raise it at this point in time, and all that he's achieving, I believe, is attracting more American attention into the area and pushing Guyana closer and closer to the United States because of the whole security issues.
Okay. Helga, there has been apparently a back and forth that's been going on since panel 1. I can't tell you much more about it, but I'm told that this was apparently caused by your making a reference to the idea of world citizen, a world citizen, what it is. And so somebody said, well, you were referencing something from Schiller, but then there was an objection, well, this should be talked about on a level that people can understand. Otherwise, we can't get unity because what does a world citizen mean, et cetera. So it was request. Apparently, this is, these things happen when you're having these. And if this is something you would address, because it might get people to think. This is coming from my associates who are following closely what's developing.
Yes, indeed, it is a remark from Schiller, who at one of his writings made the point that there is no difference between the word citizen and a patriot, or it doesn't have to be. And what he refers to is the need, and I've said this repeatedly, that we will only come out of this present crisis of geopolitics if one completely overcomes the idea that you have to defend the interest of your nation against another nation or against a group of nations, because that's geopolitical flaw, which has been the source of world wars and many other wars as well. And the way to overcome it is to make, I call it an intellectual leap, that you have to somehow, just think completely different about mankind. Think about humanity first, that we are one human species. There is only one race. All the people who think there is racism because of this or that, they're completely idiotic, because there is only one single human race. And we are literally separated in nations and different cultures and traditions and civilizations. But that, in a certain sense, is a temporary phenomena. I remember that my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, would at one point introduce this idea that while the nation state and sovereignty is extremely important, because it is the defense against the supranational usurpation of rights. So the nation state, for the time being, will have an extremely important role because it's linked to sovereignty and therefore the self-government of the people. But if you think about the long arc of human development, let's say the last 10,000 years, where we have seen a tremendous movement forward from agricultural societies, or even hunters and gatherers a little bit earlier, to eventually agriculture, the fossil fuel-based societies, then the emergence of the nation state after the 15th century in Europe. And, but that was a very short period of time in terms of the history of the universe. And provided that we can prevent World War III from happening, we will have another 10,000, 100,000, many more years. And do you really think that with the development of the human species, conquering, the world land bridge is sort of the extension of infrastructure to all continents. But then the next step will be the infrastructure development in nearby space. We already see that with the ISS space station, talk about villages on the moon. Eventually, we will have fusion power as a fuel, as a propulsion for space travel. That way we can think about building something on Mars and then other planets. Do you really think that projecting hundreds of years in the future where international cooperation will be a natural phenomena, that we will still think in terms of the separate nation states the way we do now? Maybe not. Maybe we will move into this Datong Chilche, I'm always pronouncing it wrongly, but this idea of a world harmonious community. Because I think this is not a utopia, this is a natural development where mankind will go. And once you start to think about that the one humanity is what needs to be defended first, and then you have to put the national interest into cohesion with that larger interest of one mankind, well, then it is also clear why Schiller was absolutely correct, that there must not be any contradiction between a world citizen and a patriot. A world citizen is simply a person who is not a chauvinist, who is not limited to, national limited views, who does not think Germany first, America first, Israel first, or whatever other country first, but who thinks in terms of to really make sure that there is a harmonious development of all nations, that, that humanity is one human family. And that is the point of view we should have. So if you are a good world citizen, then it's totally fine to be a good patriot as well, because that will not be in contradiction to your identity as a world citizen. So I think this is a necessary evolutionary step in the development of the human species.
Okay, so our next question is from Manfred Thiel of Germany, Thiel of Germany. There are two types of laws: the laws of nature, which we have to deal with very carefully, and there are the laws that we humans make for ourselves to ensure peaceful coexistence. These laws are changeable, and as a new neutral democratic Germany, we would change the laws for the benefits of our citizens. The BRICS countries show us how we can move from the old system to a new multipolar world if we do it together. I see the following variant for Germany: a neutral federal republic of Germany with withdrawal and abolition of NATO. Withdrawal from and abolition of NATO. Intermediate withdrawal of NATO from the Russian border and all immediate peace negotiations. Withdrawal of all foreign troops, including military equipment, from Germany. None of the newly elected dignitaries, ministers, etc. of Germany will travel to the USA before the USA has withdrawn its troops. That would then be the decision of a new democratic, neutral federal republic with a new constitution drawn up by the people. The president of our country will be elected or nominated by the people, just like the chancellor and members of the government. Question to all speakers: do you think this path is realistic for Germany or in variation for your countries? And could you imagine Mrs. Helga Sepp-LaRouche as the new German foreign minister? So that's the question. I guess it's a proposal and question. So let me ask President Ramotar if he happens to have a viewpoint on this.
Well, the first viewpoint, I think I can imagine Helga as being a chancellor. And not foreign minister. We need some sober head, cool head, and with the kind of internationalist outlook that Helga has. I think she will make an excellent head of state. As far as some of the laws is concerned, I don't think that they are impossible, but I don't think that they are that we can expect them to happen immediately. I think it will take much more time because there too much of self-interest, not enough viewing of our world as seeing it as an integrated whole, as one unit. And the ideas that Helga just expressed about humanity, we don't have enough of that. There's too much of interest about trying to make the nation state that we see in the United States, in some other NATO countries wanting to be the number one power in order to dictate to the rest of the world what they want and not necessarily what is good for the individual countries or for themselves. But I think that the ideals and the hopes are ideals that are worthwhile struggling for and fighting for. That is what I would like to say about that. That question.
Very good, very good. And I'll just ask Professor Lamar if he happens to have a view of either what Helga was talking about on the question of world citizen and patriot, or on the question that came from Germany.
Bueno, sí. En principio, ¿se escucha?
Yes.
Decía, a ver, lamentablemente durante el sistema internacional bipolar y esta forma de construcción de la arquitectura jurídica a nivel internacional, ha respondido a una visión jovesiana de las relaciones. Por supuesto, una arquitectura de esa naturaleza hace casi inconcebible la posibilidad de visualizar una ciudadanía mundial.
Excuse me, we're not able to hear
Luego,
the translation.
Entonces, esos valores que han sido expresados por la señora Helga.
Okay.
Sí.
Okay. Dennis, you want to just let him know?
Excuse me. Yes, excuse me. I'll summarize. He says we have a situation where the entire international architecture has been complicated. You cannot have a Hobbesian view. The legal structure internationally, in its first stage of development, has been based on a Hobbesian view of the main powers. Can I be heard on the English line?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Is he continuing?
Para poder concretar
to be able to fulfill that purpose of having an international society where universal citizenship becomes a reality, it's absolutely necessary to change the paradigm. And there, of course, this is going to take a long, very in-depth effort so that the minds of the decision makers, especially in the great powers, realize that the path which they have undertaken is not going to ensure a peaceful international situation, and therefore we have to change the paradigm. Of course, to the degree to which we are carrying out great efforts in the area of education, that is where you can start to change people's minds. There is a saying that is that wars begin in people's minds. Therefore, we have to work on the minds of people to be able to modify that problem and allow us then to achieve that long-standing desire, which leads to the views more associated with Kant, the German philosopher Kant, which said that the nature of man is not necessarily what Hobbes said, but rather his human nature is one based on solidarity and a more noble view of man. To the degree to which, I repeat, that we work in the field of education on those values, and that we're able to internalize, not only in civil society, but especially in the decision-making structures, then the probability of being able to make in reality concretely such a view and a society based on solidarity and peace, and that the exercise of individual rights as well as collective rights becomes a reality over a period of time.
Okay, thank you. And I'd just like to update everybody that apparently there's been a spontaneous vote in the chat room, which has decided that Helga should become the Chancellor of Germany. So that's the latest election returns that have come in. I have a kind of a final question, which I think it's a question that can be used as we can also transition to final remarks. There may or may not be one or two other questions that finally come into us, but I think this is not a bad one. This is from Antonio Hernandez, who says, "Hello and greetings from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Can we organize an international coalition of diplomats, lawyers, and politicians from the whole world and fight under international law against the United States government before they push the nuclear bomb button?" That's the sort of the both sentiment and question. And I think what we'll do is that we'll go to Professor Bonde-Lamar first. And here I'd like for you to do to sort of any final remarks you'd like to make or summary remarks and perhaps respond to the sentiment of Mr. Hernandez.
Indudablemente, en la medida en que se activen
Undoubtedly, to the extent that the various venues for dialogue are opened up for various social, political, and economic layers will join in these dialogue spaces where diplomats and politicians can be included. These will obviously encourage the generation of ideas, of the necessary synergy. Clearly, for these venues to be productive and efficient, the participant parties need to have the ability to listen. One of the great difficulties in these dialogue trials is that the participants do not necessarily have the skill to listen wisely, because this is fundamental, because to the extent that such capabilities can be grown, then common points can be arrived at to identify joint actions in which collective conscience can achieve results. So then, to reiterate, venues for dialogue are always welcome and need to be stimulated and cultivated, but they must be complemented with an ability to listen on everyone's part, so that these values can be explored in a very creative way, and technical means and judicial means can be developed to facilitate international relations in the framework of respect and reaching primarily the conditions of integrated development for the peoples.
Okay, thank you. President Ramotar?
I consider myself an internationalist, so I will share your sentiment, and I think that that would be extremely good if something like that could be created. And I don't think it's impossible, because what we're doing here today, what we have done here today, and what we have been doing for the past year or so, in having these type of meetings, bringing people from different parts of the world together to exchange view, to find consensus, to look for solutions to different problems. I think that this very process that we're in here is making a contribution directly to the aspiration that the colleague from Venezuela mentioned just now. The other point I would like to make here is one of the points that he said that one of the reasons he thinks that it's important for that to happen is to try to do it before the U.S. push the nuclear button. And that reflects one of the things that I had in mind of the quality of leadership that we have in the international arena today, particularly in the Western societies. The quality of leadership is part of the problem that we had. The same United States, it hasn't changed its character, but when John Kennedy was president, we saw the realistic position that he took in these matters, and we saw that he was moving towards, it was under him and Khrushchev, General Secretary Khrushchev, that the first agreements and arrangements were made about limiting with nuclear weapons, with the idea then when they signed those first treaties were in order to try to go towards total liquidation of nuclear weapons. And I think that is a idea that should come back up more strongly, particularly the dangers that we're all talking about now. Since then, there were only 2 countries with nuclear weapons. Now it's proliferating all over the world. Many other countries are having it, and more countries will want it for their protections and so forth. So I believe that we should continue to mount the fight for a safe war to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction. I once said on this one of the programs that we had here that I like very much a remark that I read from the scientist, what's his name, the famous physicist, scientist, who said that you can't prepare for war and expect to have peace. And the danger that exists, that frightens me every day and every night that I go to bed, is the fact that these terrible weapons exist. And once they exist, there is always a possibility that they can be used. And that is something that we cannot afford. And the need to fight for a world without nuclear weapons, without chemical weapons, without even weapons of mass destruction is very important. And that is what I would say in conclusion as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Were you referring to Robert Oppenheimer or to Albert Einstein? It was either one of them. Einstein. Okay.
Einstein.
Okay, very good. Okay, Helga?
Well, I think that I can only hope that enough people are joining our efforts and other people's efforts for peace, so that the idea of this incredibly dangerous militarization, which is going on in Europe, all of Europe right now, that can be reversed. Because, it's going on in France. Macron is maybe out more quickly. I mean, he will be president unless he resigns. But, if the opposition in France wins in 2 weeks, which is more likely than not, there can be dramatic changes if you have a government which would have the nerve to really be for peace. I think NATO, lost its raison d'etre when the Warsaw Pact dissolved. In the meantime, NATO has undergone a tremendous transformation. I mean, if you could argue that maybe in the time of the Cold War, that NATO had a legitimization as a defensive alliance, which is debatable. You don't have to have that view, but one could have that view. It for sure has not kept the character as a defensive organization. It's expanding now 6 times to the borders of Russia. It's now expanding into the Indo-Pacific. It wants to become global NATO. It's just a militaristic offensive alliance. And I think the more quickly people realize that this is not in the self-interest to be drawn into a large war by that. I mean, Germany is really in a squeeze. You have the nuclear participation. Germany has a law in the fundamental law that we should not have nuclear weapons. And I fully agree with that. It's a good thing. But that is being undermined by the nuclear participation because German pilots can fly airplanes which carry nuclear weapons in all kinds of situations. Now, there has been in the past several years ago a debate about that in the social democracy and other places, that has been silenced completely. But I think given the incredible policies of NATO right now, I think we need to have people who have the courage to say, no, that this is not in the interest of Germany. Because, if you listen to, read the book of Klaus von Donani, or listen to several of the whistleblowers who participated in NATO maneuvers, who experienced firsthand how like-minded the use of nuclear weapons, even on German territory, has been discussed in these maneuvers. Now, when you realize that in the case of war, your chance of survival is zero, why should you then be in an alliance which does that to you? And I think we need a lot more thinking people to wake up and not fall into this war drive and warmongering which we are seeing right now. So while this proposal by Manfred Thiel may not be practical today and tomorrow, I think the thinking behind it is an absolutely correct one, because why should we, if we move in the direction, what I think is the solution, an alliance or partnership of sovereign nation states, where the security interest of everyone is taken care of, and that obviously is a question of negotiation. As the Peace of Westphalia took 4 years to negotiate, but eventually we could arrive at a conception of John Quincy Adams, who said, that the United States should be a partner of perfectly sovereign republics all over the world. This was also what de Gaulle was thinking. He was thinking about a Europe of the fatherlands, of sovereign republics. And, if we move to the new paradigm, why should we not be in a position where this idea of foreign troops on your soil is really being displaced by the idea of a collective security system where, all of these questions will have to be taken care of. But eventually, I think we have to outgrow this idea of warfare. In the age of thermonuclear weapons, anybody who thinks about their use should not be in any official position. They should be in a closed department in Charenton or some other famous clinic. Peter Weiss was discussing the merits of Charenton. We can also choose another institution, but we should really think we are playing with the existence of mankind, and we need a radical thinking of creating a world of peace. So I think we should try to get out of NATO as quick as possible.
All right. Professor Henry Balden Lamar, President Donald Ramotar, and Helga Sepp-LaRouche, we want to thank you and thank everybody who participated today in the panel, including our other speakers. I also apparently just got another message that the voting continues, and Helga seems to be unanimous choice for Chancellor of Germany. So we'll keep everybody posted if there's any contender that emerges against her. This concludes our panel 2, the development aspirations of the global majority, and we'll be concluding now the first day of the 2 days of the Schiller Conference. Panel 3 will begin tomorrow. It's called at 2 p.m., 1400, Central European Time, and 8 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Its panel 3 is called The Implications of the Scientific Revolution Underway, and we hope to see you again then, tomorrow.